Hi everyone, I'm Katherine Ross. I'm a junior in the economics department. I'm from Canada, and I'm also pursuing certificates in environmental science, German language and culture, cognitive science, and linguistics. So I think a common misconception is the difference between climate and weather. Those can sometimes be conflated, but weather is essentially like, what's the weather today? Is it rainy? Is it sunny? What's the sort of short-term forecast? And climate is more longer-term patterns. So if you think about it as the political climate, for example, that's a term that's commonly used. Those are more global trends. It's not what happened in the news today, but it's longer term. As humans are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, our planet is getting warmer, and I think that's something that we talk a lot about in policy changes and different targets, trying to limit global warming to a certain amount of degrees, like 1.5 or 2. But the reality is that even though the atmosphere is getting warmer, there are a lot more impacts of climate change, and it's not just global warming, but some places are actually getting colder. And the biggest thing is that weather patterns are becoming more extreme. So we're seeing longer droughts, more frequent extreme weather events. And so I think climate change is a lot worse than global warming because it's not just the warming, but it's all the other unintended consequences of our anthropogenic emissions. But the effects of climate change are very diverse, unfortunately. So global warming is the first one. The atmosphere is getting warmer. As our planet gets warmer, ice sheets are also melting. And as those melt, there's more water in the oceans, and we're seeing sea levels rising. Also, as the oceans get warmer, just sort of basic chemistry, things get warm and they expand. So sea levels rising can cause flooding. A lot of our coastlines are very, very highly populated, so that will have huge impact on a lot of populations that live near the coast. And as I mentioned before, a lot of extreme weather patterns. So, I mean, we saw in Texas and in Tennessee this year, snowstorms, flooding, things that don't usually occur in certain regions are becoming more and more frequent. And those can have massive, massive impacts and have pretty high casualty tolls as well. Greenhouse gases are sort of a great thing. They're what allow us to live on this planet. Otherwise, all of the sun's energy would just be radiated back out into the universe, and humans would just be freezing all the time. But it's all in a very, very nice equilibrium and balance. And so there's a certain amount of energy that gets kept in the atmosphere, and then a certain amount that gets radiated back out. Greenhouse gases, as their name entails, act like a greenhouse, and so they retain a lot of the heat in the atmosphere. And so as we emit more greenhouse gases, our atmosphere is retaining even more heat. And so that's why we're seeing rising temperatures. There are a lot of policies that have happened. The UN has been working pretty hard to control and try to incentivize reductions in emissions. But as I mentioned before, the disconnect between the people emitting and the people suffering from the emissions is really hard to address with policy. It's hard to convince someone to change their behavior and change their actions in order to help someone else that's halfway across the world. And the reality is that a lot of these impacts are starting to show up gradually, but they're going to get so much more extreme once we hit a certain threshold of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so some countries feel the pressure and their sense of urgency more than others. But I think the main two policies would be the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And they essentially just set out some targets, and they all strive to limit the amount of warming in the atmosphere. I think the target might be 1.5 degrees. And they set out different schedules by which countries can limit their emissions of certain greenhouse gases in order to try to stay below that 1.5 degree threshold. With greenhouse gases, they can reside in the atmosphere for a pretty long time. So I think the first step is to stop worsening the problem and to reduce our current emissions. Eventually, we also need to backtrack and remove carbon from the atmosphere and try to return to pre-industrial levels. So I think that's stopping worsening the problem, and then actually addressing it. I think at this point, we've seen that it takes a lot of time to develop new technologies. Our planet is pretty reliant on fossil fuels at the moment, so it's not as if we can just stop emitting in the blink of an eye and turn to new, greener energy sources. So I think in the meantime, mitigation would definitely be the goal and trying to slow the growth of emissions. Eventually, reversal would be the goal, but that might take a few centuries. A lot of what we hear about climate change in the news seems like very, very big, hard to tackle problems. And yes, if you look at the stats, it's kind of frightening to see the amount that very big corporations are emitting and polluting and harming the atmosphere. But it's important to remember that little everyday actions can actually have an impact. I think at Princeton, we've seen a lot of really great student groups coming together and trying to encourage change. Divest Princeton has been a great one. But on an everyday scale, individual actions can really add up. And it's interesting to see that it's not just, I think fossil fuels have been attributed to transportation and traffic and cars, but even what you eat determines how much carbon, the size of your carbon footprint, how much you fly and how much you travel. And a lot of, even your clothes actually use a lot of carbon to be shipped across the world. So everyone can do little things every day, but it's also great to see students on campus coming together and trying to fight for what they believe in and trying to address climate change on a bigger scale. And I think also educating yourselves. Take E&V classes at Princeton, they're a great department. And it's important to learn about the topic because it is one that is very covered in the media, and sometimes there are a lot of misconceptions being thrown around there. Climate justice. I think it speaks to the importance of acting not just on behalf of your current self and your current country, but thinking of future generations as well. And I think Greta Thunberg has talked a lot about future generations, and they can't speak for themselves, and trees can't speak for themselves. And when it comes to climate, I think certain countries and certain regions have a lot more power to address things. And then certain regions are a lot more at risk of facing the consequences. And it's up to us to sort of step up to the task and fight for justice for future generations that don't even exist yet, and can't really advocate for themselves. I think that's a really hard thing to do. I mean, in economics, you're constantly trying to think of future discounting and how we always prefer current consumption rather than future consumption. But it takes a lot of courage to sort of step back and say, no, we need to act for people other than ourselves, for future generations other than ourselves, and try to identify what we care about. And hopefully we will be able to do that. Although everyday consumer actions and consumer behavior can add up. If you look at the numbers, it's quite frightening to see what some corporations have in terms of carbon footprints. And like entire countries could change the way that every day their population behaves, and that would not even have as significant of an impact. So divestment is a really feasible way of encouraging those companies to change their ways. And it's an economic incentive. So you're essentially saying, if Princeton divests, they're saying they're not investing in companies that invest in, for example, oil. It's also, I think the divesting movement has shed light on the number of companies that are out there. A lot of investment strategies, you sort of end up investing in bundles of companies that you don't know too much about. I know that the Canadian Teacher Pension Fund is invested in a lot of oil and very carbon heavy and fossil fuel dependent industries. And so the divestment movement has just opened people's eyes to the fact that their dollars are investing and supporting something that their values might not agree with. So that's been interesting, just sort of forcing investors to learn more about where their money's going. But hopefully divestment will be an economic incentive to encourage companies to act more sustainably overall. I'm glad that you're considering how your consumer behavior is affecting the environment. I would say one thing to consider, I am no stove expert, unfortunately, I'm not even a chemist, but one thing to consider is there's the toll that your appliances have on the margin and every day as you use them, and there's the toll that they have in production, and I think that second one is often forgotten. So I'd encourage you to look into not only the resources that it uses every day, like the electricity and the natural gas, but also looking at how they're produced, maybe how they're even shipped, and trying to learn more about the carbon footprint that way. But in terms of specifics of stove mechanisms and mechanics, I'm not entirely sure. Appliance switches. I think your LED light is always a good one. It's sort of a go-to. Other than that, I think there are little, even smaller changes that can be done. Not even buying new appliances, but changing the settings on your appliances. Laundry is incredible in terms of its electricity use. It's mind-boggling if you look at how much electricity one cycle in the dryer uses. So a lot of people will recommend changing the settings, going for lower heat and longer time, or shortening the time, or just trying to do less loads in a week. Other appliances, I can't think of any appliance switches per se, but I think the way that you use appliances can be even more minor tweaks. Using energy at non-peak hours can help energy companies manage the way they're producing and not have to rely on sort of emergency fossil fuel funds. Right now, a lot of renewable energy doesn't have a huge potential for production, immediately. So they sort of rely on it on lower times. So if you use electricity at non-peak hours, you allow electricity companies to try to test out those greener energies. I know that that's how it is in Canada. I'm not too sure about the States. This message is not sponsored by the ENV department at Princeton, but I would highly recommend taking ENV 200. It's an environmental nexus class, and it's one of the favorite classes I've taken at Princeton. It's super, super interdisciplinary, and it essentially takes the climate problem and the environmental problem and looks at all the different areas. So you actually get to hear from a bunch of different lecturers throughout the semester. You can take it to satisfy a bunch of different distribution requirements. I did it for STL, but you can do EM, LA, all of those things. And so you actually learn about the morals and the ethical side of things, and how do you determine what beings are sentient and what we should care about and what we should value as a society. You learn, of course, about the science behind it, the economic incentives behind it, and the literature and some of the ways that the environmental problem has been portrayed in the media, in movies, and in posters and advertising as well. So super interdisciplinary way to take a look and learn a little bit more about the issue. Also a really fun class. And other than that, no, I think reading the sustainability newsletters, of course, but I know that emails are very busy. But yeah, I think trying to learn more and maybe just picking one topic. I know that climate change can be massive and really intimidating to look into. So just picking the one issue that you're really interested in, whether it's deforestation or habitat destruction or anything like that, that would be a good way to start.